So the one question I've got from you, the audience, more than any other question in the entire history of this show has been, Glenn, how do I get my band to sound unique? And that seems to be a big issue these days. So many bands out there sound like exact duplicates of other more popular bands. It's obvious musicians have figured out how to treat music like a word processor. The copy and pasting of whole genres is rather obvious. The real question is, are musicians even using their imaginations anymore? Is there any hope for rock and roll? We've all been waiting for the next new exciting thing to blow our minds and bring in a new era of heavy metal greatness. And there is absolutely no reason it couldn't be one of you guys out there leading the charge. I'm gonna lay this out in the simplest terms possible so that everybody can understand this, even the drummers. There's no one single path or originality in music. You have to dig deep within yourself, find what works, and do that. Fortunately, you can use some common sense along the way and use some strategy when it comes to how your band is presented. It's really not that difficult to sound different from the pack once you realize what's holding you back. Number 1, stop trying to compete.
We need to compete with what's out there.
Fuck that! This is the whole fucking problem to begin with! Look, it's really easy to place the blame on modern technology for the lack of originality, and while it's partially responsible, as it's the easiest thing in the world to download a preset pack, the truth is most bands just aren't that unique or even trying to be, no matter what they tell you. Clone bands were rampant in the pre-digital days. In the late 80s, there were a million Poison wannabes. Most of those bands were called Easy, and they all had the name copywritten. At least that's what they kept telling me. Then Nirvana came along and replicated itself like a virus. On the heavier side, there was Pantera and a million clones, and in the late 90s, there were a million bands that sounded just like Korn. Today, the big thing is prog metal, and while it's produced some really great players, it seems like bands are getting their names from an architectural magazine that they found in a dentist's office. Because we sure as hell don't get fun names anymore like Buster Cherry or the Rubber Band. Instead, we get Tangents, Parallels, and Foundations. I'm sure the records will be awe-inspiring. Look, it's perfectly fine to be inspired by a great band, but when you wind up as a carbon copy of the band that inspired you, nobody is going to give a flying fuck. Case in point, I remember reading an article in a metal magazine back in the mid-90s about how all these new death metal bands were naming their influences, and they were all other death metal bands. It's like, wow, I really don't have to guess how your band's gonna sound. So what do? You pull influences from other genres. There's something to be said about pulling an influence from bands far outside your genre. Ozzy Osbourne was a gigantic Beatles fan. So were many others. Hell, one of the heaviest songs ever written that wasn't death metal, Painkiller, was written by a bunch of Beatles and Hendrix fans. The Sex Pistols kicked out their original bass player for liking the Beatles. The only problem was, he was their main songwriter, and that's why they were over after their first record. What I'm saying is take your influences from everywhere. Not just pop, but ethnic music as well. Hell, if something in polka blows your hair back, then try integrating it. Rock and roll was a fusion of blues and country. Metal took rock music, infused some horror themes, and then cranked the volume, speed, and intensity. But I've really got to wonder if music can get any heavier at this point. Songs at 300 beats per minute are technically impressive, but do they have a memorable chorus? Will anybody want to listen to it more than once for the wow factor? Going the technically impressive route has a finite limit, and it sure as hell isn't going to create better songs. So stop trying to do exactly what the hell everybody else is doing and find your own thing. Number 2, record live. There's something exciting when you gather musicians on stage to play together. Sometimes you can just feel the electricity in the air as the music takes on a life of its own and becomes more than the sum of its parts. I've seen this happen countless times. Priest in the late 80s, Deep Purple in the 90s, and most recently, Megadeth in Windsor, Ontario of all places in 2017. For a few brief moments, it was like, fuck yeah, I remember what this is like! That amazing adrenaline rush of watching a band completely in sync and energized. So what do we do in the studio? We lay down the drum tracks and stack the instruments on top of each other and turn the whole artistic process of musicians playing together into an assembly line. Henry Ford would have been proud. There's something really amazing about records out there that were performed live, or at least the bed tracks were. A lot of the Queen stuff was recorded live off the floor. Judas Priest, again, live off the floor. You throw on British Steel. That's the sound of the band set up in various rooms across Ringo Starr's house, rocking the fuck out as a unit, and it is absolutely electric. Breaking the Law, Living After Midnight, Metal Gods, all live off the floor. Now that's how rock music started, was live off the floor. If you listen closely to the Kingsmen's Louie Louie, you can even hear the drummer yell fuck when he misses a fill, and the singer comes in at the wrong time after the solo. It's not even close to perfect, but that's the point. Music isn't math, it's art. It's not supposed to be perfect. Try capturing your band as a whole and at their best. That's when you're going to begin to find your sound. Number 3, turn off the metronome. Nothing says sex, drugs, and rock and roll like a metronome. This goes right along with the play live off the floor vibe. Chances are most bands you'll be working with won't be rehearsing with a metronome over their PA. So why the hell do we insist on using one in the studio? I tracked a group in Toronto a few years back and we did a metronome thing for a couple of songs, but when the last song came up, the house engineer asked me, he says, "What's the tempo?" And I said, "Turn the metronome off on this one." He gave me a look like I just told him that there was no Santa Claus. No, I'm serious. Turn the metronome off. So we tracked the song live off the floor and no metronome. Guess what? We got rock music. Was it perfect? It's not even close. Was it fun? Absolutely. Now, I'm sure every prog metal geek in the world will have endless fun picking out every single flaw in that recording, but the thing most prog metal geeks don't realize is that just because something is technically correct doesn't mean it's any good. And it seems like most bands are fucking terrified of not playing with a metronome because all their friends are in other bands and will endlessly point out the most minor flaws. Just remember this. The prog metal geeks in other bands aren't the people you're trying to sell your music to. Try creating something memorable instead of something technically perfect. Unless, of course, you're trying to put everybody to sleep, then by all means, carry on. Number 4, stop time aligning the drums. Rock music does not happen on a grid. One more time for those in the back. Rock music does not happen on a fucking grid. Hell, most metal doesn't belong on a grid either. That's a great thing when you turn off the metronome and record the band. There's no grid to align to, so there's less of a compulsion to snap every single note to a beat. And I'm not just saying this to bands. You engineers out there, and yes, I mean you watching this show, just because you can time align everything doesn't mean you should! I promised I wouldn't use names for this little story coming up here, but I got to record drums with a band a few years ago because they liked the way how I tracked them. They wanted real drums on their record so they would stand apart from the crowd. So we spent a few days in here, tracked an album's worth of drums, and got some pretty great results. We did some punch-ins and comped some takes together, but it was definitely the sound of the band's drummer. So when they took the project to another studio to mix, guess what happened? The engineer time-aligned and sample replaced every single fucking last beat! Most of the drummer's hard work went right out the fucking window and the band sounded just like everybody else. Who fucking Ray? Now, I had a phone call with that engineer and he begged me not to name him on the show, and I just told him, dude, if they wanted that sound, they would have just recorded drums somewhere else. I say it again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. This is when the "but we need to compete" counter-argument comes up. So I asked this question: what the fuck are you trying to compete with? All the other time-aligned predictable bullshit out there that nobody cares about? Time-aligning drums might make things technically better, but it's not making music better. Rick Beato proved this with his "How Would John Bonham Sound Today" video by time-aligning classic Zeppelin beats. Stiff was his observation. Time alignment destroys the groove and edits out the drummer. Now, the drummer is the foundation of rock and metal. Try leaving him in for a change. Number 5, stop sample replacing everything. Did you know that there are other kick and snare sounds out there besides Slate number 10? No, really! Technology has made it very simple to replace a crap drum recording with something much better. The only problem is, like the 80s bands called Easy, nobody has any fucking imagination and use the same samples from the same pack as everybody else! Now, I've been the anti-samples guy for about as long as this show's been going, but turns out one of my favorite drum sounds has some very low-level sample augmentation going on. Some low-frequency synth on the kicks and a bit of white noise blended in with the snare. That was Megadeth's Peace Sells record. That's fine, it's a blend, and the drummer is still there. the overheads, tom, and room mics are still the real thing. Blending, when done tastefully, can sound fantastic. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen very much, and you can pick out when the drummer has been replaced with samples like a fart in a car, like that band I did a couple years ago. Number 6, throw Autotune in the garbage where it belongs. Now, in this instance, you can blame the technology. You've got people with no business claiming to be artists marketing themselves as singers. What would have gotten a tone-deaf Barbie thrown out of a recording studio is now wrangled into a computer-assisted abomination and passed off as music. Now let's be crystal fucking clear here. Ethically, this is exactly the same thing as an athlete taking steroids to win. Do we respect those people? Fuck no! Should we respect a singer using Autotune to pass themselves off as more talented than they really are? Of course not. We should be throwing garbage at them when they take the stage. Vocalists used to push themselves to the breaking point, and that's how we got truly inspired performances. Now, anyone can give a half-assed take and it'll wind up on a record. And if they're really, really, really good looking, they get a record contract. Because the music industry really doesn't do much music anymore. So if you're looking to stand out from the crowd, then turn that shit off! Everybody else is using it! So if you don't, you will definitely sound different than the herd. One can argue that pitch correction was done as early as the 70s, and there might even be some truth to that, but the technology put serious limits on what could be done. And the music benefited because of those limitations. A little bit of vary speed on the tape deck could slow things down, and the singer could hit the note in a lower register and speed things back up again. But that took an engineer with some skill to pull off and was used very sparingly. These days, it's kind of just set a tolerance and forget about it. Or do the ultra anal pitch correct every single fucking note, not because the music needs it, but just because we can method, which is so fucking abused these days. Let's be clear here. It's not making the band better, it's just making rock music worse. Number 7, harmonize with each other. The answer to finding your own sound and standing apart from the crowd is staring you right in the face every time you look in a mirror. I just don't understand how often this is overlooked. Start fucking singing with each other. Can't sing? Take some lessons and learn how. That's one thing I'll never understand. Why metal musicians are so reluctant to take singing lessons. Oh sure, they'll blow money on new pickups, new amps, cables, picks, cabs, all the really important shit that your audience cares about when they go see you play live. Except they don't. No, really. Nobody could give a fuck about what kind of amp you're playing at the gig. But they do respond to the vocals because everybody has a voice and that's something they can identify with. Some of the greatest bands in history not only had amazing guitar players, but they also had incredible harmonies. Queen and Van Halen, they were more than the sum of their parts because they sang with each other. And that became a huge part of their respective sounds. And this is the important part. Everybody's voice is unique. If you learn how to sing and learn how to harmonize each other, then bam! You got your own thing that won't sound like anybody else. I've pushed bands in the studio with this point and got some pretty great results. The track we used on my Mixing Metal and Reaper with Free Plugins course uses this all over the place. Song's called Medusa, metal with a female singer backed up by all the guys in the band. We got a really cool, unique sound going on with this band because they pushed hard on the harmonies and it was totally worth the effort. But what if your band's using death metal growling? Well, keep at it, as I'm sure it sounds totally unique. Just like all those other death metal bands out there that were influenced by other death metal bands. Number 8, stop using presets. This one's fairly recent. One of the best resources for metal production was the Andy Sneap Forum. From about 2005 to 2011 or so, it was the place for like-minded engineers to trade tips and tricks. Then, Joey Sturgis had a hit, and suddenly the forum was invaded by kids asking for Joey's presets. Look, presets are a great jumping off point, especially if you're just starting out with engineering. They can be a huge help in learning to understand how different elements work in a mix. But that's all they should be used for. If you're putting out a record, do you really think you should be using somebody else's presets? How the fuck is that gonna make your band stand apart from the crowd? It was bad enough in the 90s with all those carbon copy Nirvana wannabes. Now it's getting to the point where you should just call yourselves Periphery Mark II. Because at least that would be accurate. Fuck's sakes, take the training wheels off and try doing your own thing. Number 9, don't stop at 3 minutes. I remember driving back from Cleveland one day and the local radio station put on Zeppelin's Achilles' Last Stand. And I thought to myself, now here's a song Detroit radio will never touch. It's an honest-to-goodness rock epic. 10.5-minute tracks really don't fit into the modern radio format. And I learned a long time ago that is, if you throw your radio in the garbage, you'll be far happier. Rock and metal should be more than just verse, chorus, guitar solo, end. The listener is capable of digesting something longer than 3 minutes. The listener can also digest something more than breakdowns. For fuck's sakes, guys, let's try looking up from the songwriter's big book of cliches for a change. I don't know, instead of ripping off your favorite band, maybe try taking a songwriting course? That might open up some new ways of creating. It certainly can't hurt anyway. Explore some new ideas instead of going down the well-beaten songwriting trail that's now littered with so much garbage, nothing grows there anymore. And while you're at it, stop rhyming fire with desire! The Doors did it in the 60s! Try something new! Number 10. Riffs and solos are not songs. Cool riffs are great. They can be the foundation for an amazing, timeless piece of music. But a truly great song is more than just a great riff. There needs to be a melody and a hook, something that the audience can grab hold of and be part of. Guitar solos can be amazing, but they're merely icing on the cake. And a cake that's just icing has no fucking substance. Number 11, stop saying good enough. This is really where the technology is killing the music. It's far too easy to give a lackluster performance and let the engineers step in to fix everything. Suddenly, the substandard becomes acceptable. The great stuff happens when you push your performer to the limits. Needless to say, we haven't got anything great in a while. Sure, we've got proficient, maybe even good, but we haven't gotten anything like a Bohemian Rhapsody or a Stairway to Heaven in fucking decades. Granted, there's no recording budgets anymore because people collectively decided to stop buying records. I don't know, maybe we got what we deserve. Number 12, play as many shows as possible. If you're in a new band, play live as often as you can. You need time to be bad before you can become good. The only way that's gonna happen is if you get up on stage and just do it. And don't put some bullshit lame-ass performance on because you're playing for an empty room. Even if the only person at the gig is the sound guy, you should be playing like you just walked out on stage to a packed Madison Square Gardens. Because you only need one person to pass on the word about how great your show was. Word of mouth is still the best way to build a following. If you can impress somebody with your live show, chances are you'll see more people at your next one. But it's more than just building an audience. Playing live also helps you develop your sound. You're going to learn to play as a unit, and if you start harmonizing with each other, that will be refined on stage as well. You'll figure out pretty quickly what works and what doesn't, and what gets the best audience reaction. If you can get to the point where you can play your songs flawlessly on stage, then you will absolutely crush it in the studio, especially if you can do it live off the floor. Number 13, grow a pair. Am I missing something here, or are bands too terrified to talk about the issues of the day? I could be completely wrong here, but it seems Crosby, Stills, and Nash had way more balls than most modern metal bands because they put out the song Ohio, which was about the Kent State Massacre. Today's political climate has got so much great material for songwriting. Is anybody doing anything about it? Or have we become so terrified of offending anybody that it's stifling creativity? And I mean politics from both sides of the spectrum. Nobody wants to get canceled for the crime of saying things that other people disagree with. But bands used to actually stand up for something. Rage Against the Machine shut down the stock exchange while filming a music video on Wall Street. These days, it seems bands aren't raging against the machine, they're raging for it. I mean, John Schaefer facing federal charges for storming the Capitol? I mean, how thick can you get? If the right guy didn't get elected, then write a fucking song about it! Don't try and stop an election certification, you dumb motherfucker! There is so much going on these days. Sea life die-off on the west coast of Canada. Global warming becoming an undeniable threat to life on Earth. The radical right militias trying to end democracy. The QAnon morons. The pandemic and the anti-vaxxers. If you're looking for source material to write a song about, then open your eyes, because now's the fucking time! It doesn't matter if you offend someone. Don't let somebody else's feelings determine your worldview. Use music to say what's on your mind. If it resonates, people will respond. Now, rock bands used to use controversy to generate album sales. Idiots like Tipper Gore got their panties in a twist over lyrics back in the 80s and forced the record labels to put warning stickers on their product. All this did was guarantee that those albums would sell more copies. Myself, I did a raunchy Benny Hill style music video for a local band a few years ago. It featured a bunch of models in some very revealing clothing, and the local hipster crowd lost their collective shit over this. They bitched, they complained, and they kept hitting that play button. over and over and over again. They were so outraged they were going to organize protests at the band's gigs. And when the band had their CD release show, the venue was packed with fans. But to nobody's surprise, not a single protester bothered showing up, because that would have required effort, and it's far easier to sit around and bitch. It never once occurred to anybody who complained that if they didn't like it, they could have just not watched it. But say you do get a bunch of protesters at your show. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because all that's going to do is create interest in your band, and questions will follow. Why is this group generating so much controversy? What do they sound like? Now, the self-righteous always insist that everybody must do things the way how they say so. It's not enough to not buy something or to not watch something. They insist that nobody else can buy it or watch it either because it offends their personal morals. Steel Panther released the Pussy Melter distortion pedal a few years ago, and it caused an absolute shitstorm. Reverb.com banned its sales, and that only helped it become a bestseller, which eventually sold out completely. Apparently, nobody at Reverb ever considered recent history with the PMRC or the Streisand effect. Now, the band was cool enough to give me their last copy of that pedal, and I've still got it. I doubt it would have ever sold anywhere nearly as well if people hadn't bitched about it. But let's get something straight here. Don't be a moron when it comes to this sort of thing. Nobody is telling you to go out and write a bunch of racist lyrics or hateful shit about marginalized groups. That's not what's being said here. The black metal bands of the early 90s used to burn churches down, and I gotta disagree with that. Sure, go ahead, call the church out for the hypocritical tax-dodging bastards that they are. But violence shows a severe lack of imagination. Write some lyrics that call them out as hypocritical tax-dodging bastards that they are. The pen is still mightier than the sword. You have just got to pick it up. Excuse me.